Hey guys, I'd like to start this podcast by saying two things. Number one, I am recording this from my phone, so the mic is not going to be of amazing quality. And two, I'm so incredibly sorry that we haven't uploaded anything in 6 months, nearly 7 now. Both Krista and I have been through the ringer ever since we uploaded the first podcast. We did have a second one recorded, and it was in the process of being edited, but both Krista and I decided that we were not going to post it because we didn't really like it. Schoolwork has just become exponentially harder, and on top of that, quarantine started, so it was impossible to make a new episode together. And on top of that, teachers decided to make our lives a lot harder by piling work on top of us, which was so difficult to deal with. I even got homework for PE. Like, who gives gym homework? But anyways, we're back. Or at least, I'm back. There has been an update to this channel. Krista has decided to take a bit of a backseat for this podcast channel. It's been really hectic for us, and with a lot of test dates and things of those sorts being pushed back and altered and whatnot, it's kind of hard for her to be on top of this channel. But good news, she's not gone. She will be a special guest every once in a while, but at least for now, this channel is essentially my child. So, with all that being said, I just wanted to talk about something that I think is incredibly important to everyone in this day and age. Voting! Okay, so a brief history on voting before I start the discussion is the entire point of voting came from getting represented by government officials. This was the entire point of the American Revolution back in the late 1700s because if you took a history class and you know this, the 13 original colonies used to be owned by Great Britain, and because Great Britain was sort of our motherland, they had the right to tax us. Despite this fact, there was no representation for the colonists in Parliament. And this birthed the famous quote, "No taxation without representation." So, ultimately, America broke free from England, after a war, the American Revolution, and they established a representative government. And for an incredibly long time in history, only land-owning white males were allowed to vote. Then, all white males were allowed to vote, regardless of if they own land or not. And then men of color were allowed to vote per the 15th Amendment, which was amended into the Constitution and ratified into the Constitution in 1870. And then women were given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So, all is dandy because now finally everyone can vote. And voting has come a long way in America, but there still are discrepancies when it comes to voting. There's a demographic in America that still does not have the right to vote: incarcerated people. Now, this issue is a bit iffy to say the least. I do personally think that people that are in jail for horrendous and heinous crimes may or may not deserve to participate in democracy. Being a danger to society should strip you of the right to decide who represents that same society. However, there are many factors to incarceration in America that should be discussed. First and foremost, between 1980 and 2015, the population of incarcerated people rose from approximately 500,000 people to over 2.2 million, which means that around 5% of America is currently in jail. I would like to point out that this is purely the people in jail, so it does not include those that are part of correctional programs. So that's just how many people are in jail as of right now. When we get a little bit more specific with this conversation and shift it to one about race, a portrait of racial disparity becomes evident. African Americans are 5 times more likely to be jailed than that of white people. Now, I've heard the argument that this is because African Americans commit around half of the crime in this country, and over 1 million people are arrested for drug possession every year. Every 1 in 5 incarcerated people is in jail for a drug offense, and on any given day, 451,000 people will be in jail for non-violent drug offenses. So, what exactly does this have to do with African Americans and racial disparity? Well, 62% of drug offenders that are incarcerated are black. Additionally, in 7 states, 80 to 90% of all people sent to jail on drug offenses are black. Obviously, black people are incarcerated at a much higher rate for nonviolent drug offenses. 46% of inmates are in jail for drug-related crimes, and in comparison to homicide, kidnapping, and aggravated assault offenses, which make up 3.2% of the inmates, or immigration offenses, which make up 4.9% of inmates, and weapons, explosives, and arson offenses, which make up 19.6% of inmates, that's a pretty big number. That's nearly half the people in jail. But you guys already knew that because you guys are smart and can do math. Now, here's the disparity with voting. In 48 states out of the 50, incarcerated people do not have the right to vote while they're still in jail. For a country that was founded on the importance of representation in government, we sure do strip the rights of felons to vote. Once again, I think that people who are a danger to society should not be able to vote, and I think quite a few people think that too. However, when the majority of these felons are in jail for non-violent drug-related offenses, the vast majority of whom are black men, the rights of incarcerated people of color are basically stripped. This isn't anything new either. The war on drugs, which was started by Richard Nixon, painted black people to be violent drug dealers, especially during his presidency. He passed harsher sentencing laws for low-level drug offenses. Though this had occurred nearly 50 years ago, the effects of mass incarceration of black people are still felt to this day. This leaves African Americans in jail, which makes up around 58% of those who are incarcerated, disenfranchised. The second topic I wanted to address is how Americans are represented in government. Now, I mentioned earlier how America came to be because the colonists were not receiving enough representation in Parliament. And nearly a century after that, we decided that the government was of the people, by the people, for the people, thanks to Abraham Lincoln and his Gettysburg Address. I like to argue, however, that that's not the case, at least not in modern times. America is composed of so many different demographics from so many different countries. However, a lot of our officials are, crudely put, elitist. They received private education their entire lives, attended, the vast majority of them at least, attended an Ivy League, worked in official positions that only an incredibly small percentage of our population worked in. They did so many of the things that most Americans do not have the opportunity to do. These people, to be blunt, grew up with a lot of privilege. Now, this, in my opinion, mainly has to do with the fact that these officials were born into families with money. So they had the privilege, ability, and capacity to afford that kind of lifestyle that only an incredibly small part of America can afford as well. Approximately, the working class makes up around 60% of the labor force. However, only 4% of candidates for state legislatures from both the Republican and the Democratic parties come from working class jobs. The vast majority of our representatives come from backgrounds that are not compatible with the way most Americans grew up. A lot of Americans come from big families that don't make enough money to get by. Personally speaking, as someone who comes from an immigrant family, I grew up watching my parents bend over backwards to make enough money to give my sister and I a comfortable and happy life. They sacrificed so much just to try and get by, and yet, these people who are meant to represent us and give us a voice have no idea what it's like to watch your parents take up several jobs and be working for most of their days. They have no idea what life is like outside of their mansions. These people grew up with wealthy parents who didn't have to do what most of our parents did. How could they ever understand? That's the thing. They don't. These representatives aren't the only ones to blame either. It's also the people who are voting for upper echelon officials without realizing that these people really don't understand the struggles of Americans. Voters were surveyed in 2014, where they were asked directly why less people from the working class held office positions. 75% of these people said that it's because the working class people are less qualified. That makes me wonder, does living a life of wealth and privilege, getting into a university with a single-digit acceptance rate, and not understanding the struggles of the common working-class American make you more qualified to represent those same people? Because in my honest opinion, it really does not. At all. So this was kind of a somber episode. I apologize for that. But after all the events that have unfolded in this country with the killing of George Floyd and so many more horrifying deaths of Black people, I just thought it was necessary to discuss making long-term changes in this country. I mentioned that voting is incredibly important at the beginning of this episode. I hope that my rambling was comprehensive enough to explain why it's so important for everyone to vote for someone that they think really understands what most Americans live like day to day. We must vote for people who truly hear our voices, not for people who enable mass incarceration and police brutality. There is a calendar made by the New York Times that includes all the dates that pertain to voting. I know all the voting dates for primaries have passed, but we can't forget about the big day in November. We need to change the tide of history and vote. I know not a lot of people vote. It has been a downward trend, but I think it's so important to actually vote for people who understand what most of America faces and actually listens to the people who vote for them. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I hope to see you soon. Oh, and actually, right before I go, all of the sources that I used will be linked below. So if you guys want to just read up on some of the stuff that I read up on, definitely go check those links out. They provided a lot of information. If you guys agree with what I said, please comment down below. And if you guys don't agree with what I said and think that it was stupid, also comment down below. I really want to have a conversation about this with whoever I can have a conversation with, whoever's willing. But yeah, once again, sorry to stall, but once again, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Once again, I keep saying once again, I'm sorry. I apologize for taking our sweet time uploading our next podcast. It has been quite some time. It's been hectic, but I will try to start uploading more frequently. And I hope to see you guys soon.